April 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but the world's wounds were still fresh and raw. That's when something almost unthinkable happened. German prisoners of war, men who had fought against the United States only weeks before, stood in stunned silence as American soldiers handed warm cornbread and glass bottles of Coca-Cola to their hungry children. Enemies yesterday, caretakers today. If that sounds impossible, stay with me, because this story isn't about treaties or commanders. It's about ordinary soldiers who, in the middle of devastation, chose humanity over hate. In the rolling farmland of Georgia, Camp Ashford sat on the edge of a cotton mill that hadn't spun a thread since half its workers had been drafted to Europe. The camp was little more than a patchwork of wooden barracks wrapped in barbed wire. Inside those fences were over 3,000 German POWs, mechanics, farmhands, and once proud soldiers stripped of their uniforms, waiting for a war they no longer believed in to end. Surrender was supposed to mean humiliation, hunger, isolation. But the Americans who guarded them were farmers' sons too, and they knew the sound of a hungry child as well as the sound of boots on gravel. One morning, Private Lewis Carter, barely 22, with calloused hands and a southern drawl thick as syrup, was on mess duty when he saw them. Two children standing just outside the wire, barefoot, clutching each other. They weren't supposed to be there. The guards shouted, ready to chase them off, but Carter hesitated. He'd been raised on his grandmother's porch, where the skillet never went cold, and the rule was simple: you feed the smallest first. Against every posted regulation, Carter did something no manual prepared him for. He tore a piece of cornbread still steaming from the pan, handed it through the fence, then rolled a bottle of Coca-Cola across the dirt toward the little boy. The children stared, afraid it might be a trick. But when the boy finally grabbed the bottle and twisted the cap with shaking hands, the hiss of carbonation was louder than the guard's orders. For the first time in months, someone in that camp smiled. Their father, Sergeant Friedrich Adler, stepped forward slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as monsters who would hurt German children. Yet here they were, feeding them, not with pity, but with care. That single act cracked something deeper than the barbed wire ever could. The wall of hate built by years of war. Word spread fast through the camp. By evening, dozens of German prisoners found excuses to linger near the fence, pretending to hang laundry just to see the Americans who had fed their children. Some even smiled awkwardly, as though their faces had forgotten how. Sergeant James O'Connor, the camp supervisor, noticed. "What in God's name is going on over there?" he barked, stomping toward the mess tent. But even he stopped short when he saw Carter ladling soup into tin bowls and slipping an extra biscuit under the wire. "These are enemy civilians," O'Connor snapped. "You'll answer for this." Carter didn't argue. He just kept ladling, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, my grandma used to say, when you got food, you share it." "Even if it's your enemy's kid," O'Connor stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Keep it quiet. I didn't see a damn thing." That night the air buzzed with uneasy peace. American guards smoked beside their rifles. German prisoners whispered in their barracks, wondering how a piece of bread and a bottle of soda could feel more powerful than any victory speech. In the days that followed, more small rebellions bloomed. A corporal fixed a German child's broken shoe. Another soldier drew cartoon animals in the dirt to make the kids laugh. Someone even rigged a makeshift seesaw out of scrap lumber. And then the real miracle happened, one the newspapers never printed. The prisoners began baking. Using leftover flour and salt from their rations, they made bread for the American soldiers. To return kindness, one man explained in broken English. Inside Camp Ashford, enemies began to share recipes instead of bullets, laughter instead of suspicion. The world outside was still bleeding, but inside those wire fences, something new was being born. A fragile trust built not on politics or surrender papers, but on shared hunger and shared humanity. The cornbread had started it, the Coca-Cola had sealed it, but what grew afterward was something no order could stop. Men who had once faced each other through rifle sights now waited together for the smell of supper, for the sound of children laughing in the distance, and for the chance, just maybe, to believe that even after everything, decency could still survive the wreckage. The first days after that cornbread morning felt like peace dressed in borrowed clothes. The camp was quieter somehow, the guards moving slower, the prisoners less afraid to meet their eyes. Carter noticed how even the wind changed tone, softer now, carrying the smell of yeast instead of gunpowder. But peace, especially in wartime, never goes unnoticed for long. 3 nights later, during inspection, a supply officer named Lieutenant Harold Briggs caught sight of the makeshift oven the prisoners had built from scrap tin and broken bricks. At first, he thought it was contraband. Then he saw what lay inside, small loaves of bread, each carefully shaped, the crusts browned just right. One loaf was cooling on a wooden plank, and someone had carved a word into the top, Danke. Briggs frowned. Whose idea was this? Nobody spoke. He turned to Sergeant O'Connor. You've got your men trading food with enemy prisoners. You know what that looks like in a report? O'Connor's jaw tightened. Looks like hungry people trying to stay alive, sir. Looks like a court-martial waiting to happen. Briggs shot back. This isn't charity. It's the United States Army. Discipline keeps us alive. But even as he spoke, a German boy, barely taller than Briggs's belt, peeked out from behind the barracks, clutching the empty Coca-Cola bottle he'd turned into a toy. The lieutenant froze. The boy smiled shyly, waved, and darted back into the shadows. For one heartbeat, Briggs's voice faltered. By morning, word of the bread exchange had reached command. Regulations were repeated, warnings handed down, no fraternization, no aid, no contact beyond assigned duties. But every soldier knew what that really meant. Pretend not to care, pretend not to see. Carter didn't pretend well. He began taking scraps from the mess tent, hiding them in his jacket, slipping them to the children through holes in the wire. The German prisoners started saving too, bits of salt, small potatoes, even coffee grounds, to trade back in secret gratitude. It wasn't defiance for glory, it was survival with dignity. One evening, as dusk spread purple over the camp, Carter sat by the fence, whittling a piece of wood into a small bird. On the other side sat Friedrich Adler, the German sergeant whose children had first been fed. He watched silently, then spoke in hesitant English. "Bird?" Carter nodded. "For your little girl." "Maria, right?" Adler's expression softened. She likes to sing. She will like this." Carter handed the carving through the wire. For a moment their fingers touched, the briefest connection between two men who, in another life, might have killed each other without hesitation. "War make us fools," Adler said quietly. "Maybe kindness make us men again." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The next day, a truckload of new American officers arrived from headquarters. Among them was Captain Reynolds, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of stone and trained to distrust smiles. He carried himself with the authority of someone who measured morality by the weight of paperwork. By sundown, every act of compassion that had bloomed inside Camp Ashford was stamped out in ink. New orders, new punishments, new silence. but the heart of the camp refused to listen. Late that night, when most of the guards were asleep, Carter crept to the fence again. He found a folded scrap of paper wedged in the wire. On it, scrawled in shaky English, were the words, "You feed us, we remember." Underneath was a child's drawing, a rough sketch of a hand holding bread. Carter folded the note and tucked it inside his uniform pocket, right above his heart. Days stretched into weeks. The camp's rhythm settled into something almost normal again, except for the quiet rebellion that pulsed beneath it. Carter wasn't the only one anymore. Martinez from Texas shared his cigarettes with the older prisoners. Doc Miller smuggled cough syrup to Maria when her breathing worsened. Even O'Connor, the hard-nosed sergeant who'd once barked orders like cannon fire, started slipping extra rations into supply crates. Every gesture was a risk, every kindness an act of defiance. Then, without warning, the illusion shattered. A convoy rolled in one grey morning, carrying a new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Blake. He was young, ambitious, and utterly devoted to regulation. His jeep was spotless, his uniform pressed, his clipboard full of fresh rules. The moment Carter saw him, he felt the same cold dread he'd felt before the first artillery shell back in France. Men like Blake didn't believe in small mercies. Blake addressed the assembled guards with clipped precision. "Effective immediately," he announced. "There will be no unauthorized exchanges, no informal communications, and no feeding of enemy civilians. You will maintain distance and discipline at all times." No one spoke. Carter stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, while Martinez's hand hovered near his shoulder, a silent warning to stay quiet. When the meeting ended, Blake walked the perimeter, inspecting every post. He stopped near the fence where Carter usually stood. The note, the child's drawing, had fallen loose and was stuck between the wires. Blake pulled it free, studied it, then turned to Carter. "Yours?" Carter swallowed. "Found it there, sir." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Burn it." Carter hesitated. Then, slowly, he tore the drawing in half, letting the pieces drift to the dirt. Blake nodded once, satisfied, and moved on. But Carter didn't burn the rest. He'd already hidden the original note in his Bible, between the pages where his grandmother's handwriting still marked the words, "Feed the smallest first." That night, rain fell hard, drumming against tin roofs, washing away footprints and chalk lines alike. Somewhere inside the German barracks, children whispered to one another, asking if the Americans would bring cornbread again when the sun rose. Their father told them no, not anymore, but even he didn't sound certain. Across the camp, Carter lay awake, listening to the storm, feeling every drop strike the roof like the ticking of a clock running out of mercy. He thought of the little boy's grin, the girl's cough, the word Danke carved into bread. He thought of how easily compassion could be erased by one man's pen, and he knew he couldn't let it end like that. The next morning, before roll call, he packed his canteen, filled a tin with leftover stew, and walked straight to the fence. When no officers were looking, he set the tin down in the mud, whispered, "Breakfast," and walked away. On the other side, tiny fingers reached through the wire and pulled it close. That single act, quiet, invisible, forbidden, kept the fragile bridge alive. Even when the officers changed, even when reports were written and rewritten, even when the world outside the camp forgot them, those moments stayed. Bread shared, soda passed, a bird carved from scrap wood, little sparks of decency that refused to die out. Because in a world rebuilt on ashes, sometimes it only takes one man's choice to prove that kindness still outranks any uniform ever stitched. 2 weeks passed. The rain gave way to spring sun, and the camp grass grew tall enough to hide secrets. The fences still stood, sharp and humming, But something in the air had changed. The laughter was gone. The children no longer came to the wire. Even the prisoners seemed quieter, retreating into the routines of survival. The warmth that had briefly lived between two sides of war was cooling into silence again. Private Carter moved through his days like a ghost. The mess hall smelled the same, the soup tasted the same, but everything felt smaller. Orders were followed. Heads stayed down. But every night as he scrubbed the pots, he'd glance toward the barracks, waiting for one glimpse of the children who had once waved at him. He didn't see them again until the night the fire started. It was near midnight when the first shout broke the stillness. Flames licked up the wooden siding of the eastern barrack, spreading fast in the wind. Men scrambled, shouting in both English and German. Someone yelled for water, someone else for the medics. The prisoners, terrified and barefoot, rushed toward the fence, shouting names, calling for the guards. Carter didn't wait for orders. He ran. He and Martinez grabbed buckets, sprinting toward the blaze, knowing there wasn't time to form lines or wait for permission. The fire roared through the dry lumber like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Carter could hear children crying inside the nearest barrack. He broke from the line, vaulted over a water drum, and sprinted straight toward the heat. "Carter!" O'Connor shouted after him, but his voice was swallowed by the flames. The door was jammed. Carter kicked until it splintered, and the heat slapped him backward. Through the haze, he saw two small figures huddled under a bunk, Hans and Maria Adler, the same children who'd tasted his cornbread and soda. Their father lay unconscious nearby, a beam across his leg. Carter dropped to his knees, dragging the beam free, coughing so hard he thought his lungs would tear. "Come on," he gasped, pulling the children close. He wrapped his jacket around them, guided them through the smoke, one arm around their father's shoulders. The roof groaned above them, spitting sparks like angry stars. When they finally stumbled out into the cold air, the prisoners on the other side of the fence were shouting, pressing against the wire. Guards ran forward, shouting commands that no one listened to. Carter fell to his knees, choking, his uniform scorched. Maria was sobbing into his chest. Hans clutched his hand and wouldn't let go. For a moment, just one, the war stopped. Even Lieutenant Colonel Blake, standing stiff by the command tent, froze. The sight of his own soldier hauling a German sergeant and two children from the fire was something no manual could explain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. By dawn, the fire was out. 2 barracks were gone, but everyone had survived. The prisoners worked alongside the guards to rebuild, silent and grim, but united by exhaustion and something deeper. Carter sat outside the infirmary, his hands wrapped in bandages, watching the children sleep through the window. O'Connor sat beside him, chewing on a cigarette that wasn't lit. "You're lucky Blake didn't have you court-martialed," he said quietly. Carter didn't answer. He was staring at Hans's small hand, resting on the blanket. "That kid shouldn't have to be brave anymore," he murmured. O'Connor followed his gaze. "You did good, son." Sometimes orders need reminding who they work for. The following afternoon, something unexpected happened. The German prisoners gathered in the yard, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the officer's tent. At their front was Friedrich Adler, his leg bound, but his back straight. In his hands he held a small loaf of bread, its crust golden, its top carved with a single English word. "Thanks." He crossed the yard slowly, limping, until he stood before Colonel Blake. The camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to wait. Blake looked at the loaf, then at Adler, then at Carter standing in the distance. "You're not supposed to approach this area," Blake said, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. Adler nodded once, "We know, but kindness is not against rules." He extended the bread. Blake hesitated for what felt like forever. Then, to everyone's disbelief, he took it. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not applause, not words, just a quiet shift, like the ground itself exhaled. Blake handed the loaf to Carter. "Private," he said, his voice low. "Seems this one's yours." Carter took it carefully, holding it like something fragile enough to break the wrong kind of silence. That evening, instead of the usual rations, the mess served cornbread again, warm, thick, shared evenly among guards and prisoners alike. Blake didn't stop it. Martinez swore he even saw the colonel smile once. For the first time since the camp was built, there were no fences that night, at least not the kind you could see. Weeks later, word came that the war in Europe was officially over. The men cheered, some cried, some prayed. Repatriation lists were drawn up. The prisoners would soon be sent home. The guards would move on to other duties, other wars, other borders. On his last day at Camp Ashford, Carter found a folded piece of paper tucked under his cot. It was from Friedrich Adler. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. "You gave my children back their trust in men," it read, "and you gave me back my faith in God. When they eat bread again in Germany, they will remember the taste of kindness." Carter folded the note and placed it beside the old one still tucked in his Bible. 2 pieces of paper, written in 2 different languages, both saying the same thing: "Feed them, always feed them." When the transport trucks pulled away, Hans and Maria stood at the gate. Maria waved the wooden bird he had carved, its wings now painted blue. Hans lifted a glass bottle high into the air, a Coca-Cola bottle, cleaned, filled with daisies. Carter raised his hand in return, his throat tight, his heart heavier than his pack. As the camp disappeared behind a bend of red clay road, he thought about everything that had happened there, how bread, soda, and a few stubborn hearts had done what politics never could. War had made them enemies. Kindness made them human again. And somewhere, deep in the Georgia fields where the barracks had once stood, the scent of cornbread lingered long after the soldiers were gone. Because some stories don't end with victory or surrender, they end with a choice. And on that spring morning, when an American soldier fed a German child with cornbread and Coca-Cola, humanity chose itself, one bite at a time. The train home rattled like an old memory that refused to settle. Carter sat near the window, the countryside rolling past in long green streaks. He hadn't taken off his uniform yet. Part of him didn't know how. In his pocket, he carried the 2 letters, folded so many times the creases had begun to fray. Every mile of track carried him farther from the camp, but the smell of cornbread still followed him. When the train stopped in Savannah, soldiers poured onto the platform, welcomed by families and brass bands. Carter stepped off quietly, blending into the crowd, his duffel heavy with dirt and something he couldn't name. Outside the station, a woman in a floral dress handed out small paper cups of Coca-Cola to returning men. He took one, raised it slightly in silent acknowledgement, and kept walking. Home was smaller than he remembered. The porch sagged, the paint had peeled, but the skillet still hung by the door. His grandmother was gone now, the grave marked by a wooden cross that leaned slightly toward the magnolia tree. He knelt beside it and set down a loaf of bread he'd baked himself, the same recipe he'd shared with the Germans. "I did what you taught me," he whispered, "fed the smallest first." In town, people spoke of the war like it was a story someone else had written. They wanted heroes, clean endings, easy answers. Carter gave them none. When neighbors asked if he'd seen the enemy, he just said, "I saw people." That usually ended the conversation. He found work at the cotton mill, though the machines still clanked like distant artillery. On Sundays, he volunteered at the church kitchen, serving stew to families who'd lost sons and husbands. He never mentioned Camp Ashford, but every time he ladled food, he remembered the hands that had reached through the wire and the quiet word of thanks that crossed languages. A year later, an envelope arrived with foreign stamps. Inside was a photograph, 2 children standing in front of a rebuilt farmhouse, holding a small loaf of bread between them. On the back, written in careful English, were the words, "From Hans and Maria, for our friend who gave us hope." Carter stared at it for a long time, then pinned it above the stove. The edges curled with heat, but he never took it down. Time moved the way rivers do, slow, steady, unstoppable. By the time the Korean War began, Carter had gray in his hair. Young men asked him what it had been like fighting the Nazis. He told them about long nights and longer silences, about the smell of smoke and the sound of children laughing behind fences. "You win wars with bullets," he'd say, "but you end them with bread." Every Christmas, he baked cornbread using the same old skillet, wrapped a few slices in brown paper, and left them on neighbors' porches. No note, no explanation, just warmth shared in the cold. Years later, when Carter's health began to fail, he moved into a small veterans' home on the edge of town. The nurses said he talked in his sleep, soft words in German and English, sometimes names, sometimes just children first. They thought it was delirium. It wasn't. It was memory. One spring morning, a letter arrived from overseas addressed in a careful hand. It came from Bremen, Germany. Inside was another photograph, this time of 2 grown adults standing in front of a bakery window. The sign read, "Brot und Herz," bread and heart. Below it, a note in English, "Your cornbread taught us how to start again." Carter smiled when he read it. He asked the nurse for a small bottle of Coca-Cola, poured a bit into a glass, and raised it toward the window where sunlight spilled across the floor. "To the smallest first," he said softly. When he passed that summer, they found the photo pinned beside his bed and the old Bible on the nightstand. Inside, between worn pages, were the 2 original notes, one from a child's hand, one from a grateful father. The staff didn't understand their story, but they kept them together, bound by a ribbon. At his funeral, the pastor read from the Gospel of Matthew, but what lingered most wasn't scripture. It was the smell from the church kitchen where volunteers baked trays of cornbread to serve after the service. No one knew why, only that it felt right. Half a world away, in that bakery in Bremen, a woman named Maria lit a candle on the counter. Her brother Hans stood beside her, watching as customers came in carrying ration cards and left with warm loaves wrapped in paper. Above the door hung a small photograph of a young American soldier in uniform. Beneath it, the words they'd painted years ago, "Feed the smallest first." Sometimes a single act outlives its witness. Sometimes kindness moves through time the way light crosses water, broken by distance, but never truly gone. Long after the uniforms are folded away, after the medals tarnish and the battles fade into textbooks, the story of Camp Ashford survives in whispers, about a soldier who fed the children of his enemy and taught a generation that mercy doesn't need permission. And maybe somewhere, in the soft corners of memory, the echo of glass bottles clinking and bread breaking still carries on the wind. A reminder that even in war, humanity can taste like cornbread and Coca-Cola shared under a forgiving sky.